Thank you. Good evening, everyone. In collaboration with the Mississauga Library System, we thank you for attending tonight's fourth Lecture Me talk of the 2024-25 season. My name is James Malinowski, and I am the Community Engagement Officer in the Experiential Education Unit within the Office of the Vice Principal, Academic and Dean at the University of Toronto, Mississauga. It is my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Professor Anna Thomas from the Department of English and Drama, who will be delivering her talk entitled Poetry is Not a Luxury, Resources for Survival in Black Women's Writing. Professor Thomas is Assistant Professor of English at the University of Toronto, where she researches and teaches African American and Caribbean literature. Over to you, Professor Thomas.
Good evening. Let's read together. For the Young Who Want to Die by Gwendolyn Brooks. Sit down, inhale, exhale. The gun will wait, the lake will wait, the tall ball in the small seductive vial will wait, will wait. We'll wait a week, we'll wait through April. You do not have to die this certain day. Death will abide, will pamper your postponement. I assure you, death will wait. Death has a lot of time. Death can attend to you tomorrow or next week. Death is just down the street. His most obliging neighbor can meet you any moment. You do not need to die today. Stay here. Through pout or pain or peskiness, stay here. See what the news is going to be tomorrow. Graves grow no green that you can use. Remember, green's your color. You are spring. This is from Bell Hooks' Theory as Liberatory Practice. Let me begin by saying I came to theory because I was hurting. The pain within me was so intense that I could not go on living. I came to theory desperate, wanting to comprehend, to grasp what was happening around and within me. Most importantly, I wanted to make the hurt go away. I saw in theory then a location for healing. In her Nobel lecture in literature, Toni Morrison tells the story of an enslaved blind seer at the edge of a plantation who is visited by youths intent on testing her with a question. They have a bird in their hands and they say, "Is the bird in our hands alive or dead?" She replies, "I don't know whether the bird you are holding is dead or alive, but what I do know is that it is in your hands." It's a striking response, giving over responsibility for life and representation to the next generation. But the tale does not end there. The youth respond to what they feel is her abdication. Is there no speech, no words you can give us that help us break through your dossier of failures? How dare you talk to us of duty when we stand waist deep in the toxin of your past? For even if the question is a ruse to trick a blind woman and show that she is no seer, perhaps the question meant, could someone tell us what is life? What is death? Thank you for being here. Thank you to James and Adriano and the team at ETM's Office of the Vice Principal, Academic and Dean, and to Elsie, Elizabeth, Dilke, Suzanne, and Anne at the Mississauga Library, and those whose names I don't know, but whose labor makes this event possible. Thank you all for your labor and your attendance. I also want to acknowledge my father, who's joining online on his birthday today, so happy birthday, Papa. He's a man who knows about survival all too well, and not incidentally about poetry too. So thank you all. Let's read together. These three ways to open this lecture on survival show some of the ways that Black women have considered and written about the problem of suffering and the problem of survival, through address and poetry, through introspective encounters with theory, and through the question of pedagogy in an intergenerational context rife with misunderstanding, resignation, and anger. This makes these questions more urgent. Could someone tell us what is life? What is death? This is a way to ask how to live, how to be, and how to survive. This has long been a question in the humanities, and as I'll show in the next little while, a necessary task of poetry. Each time I read a poem, I must learn to read anew. That is poetry's first lesson in survival, humility. Not the humiliation of feeling ignorant, but humility in the face of depth and complexity. Each poem is a teacher. I have also been taught to read many times, first by my mother, most recently by my student this morning, who showed me something new in a text I thought I wouldn't be surprised by. Shortly, again, by this instance of reading these poems, familiar ones, with you in a new context. I also learned to read with literary critics. The professor and scholar Kevin Quashie is one such. Here is what he says in his luminous books about its message and its aims. In Black Aliveness, or A Poeticist Being, I am interested, this is Quashie speaking, I am interested in theorizing aliveness through poems of relation and first-person essays, especially in considering the philosophical work of pronouns, one, me, I, and verbs, imperatives, subjunctives. I believe that an aesthetic of aliveness makes possible an encounter with the ethical question, how to be. That is, though an anti-Black world would to foreclose ethical possibility for the one who is Black, in the totality of a Black world, we can conceptualize how to be as a reckoning of human capacity, as the right and burden of being. Let's have these two teachers speak to each other. Here is every verb in the first poem I read out. This is what the poem would look like if it were only verbs. Following Quashie's invitation to read for these action words, I am particularly drawn to the insistent futurity, will wait, will wait, will wait, will abide, will pamper. I'm struck by the simple instructions of the present tense. Sit down, inhale, exhale, stay, stay, see, remember. I'm struck by the verb use, implying that this is the proper verb for use, the using of green. If we look to pronouns, I am most struck by the singular example of the speaker's I. I assure you. We'll think more about speakers in poems in a bit, but here the clear statement, I assure you, stands out for me. This is a speaker who it is implied is older than the youth they address, who has the capacity to assure and to describe. You are spring. Let's take the same curiosity to Morrison's prose. Here, thinking about pronouns helps me to see a shift from the accusatory. What do I know? What I do know is that it is in your hands, and how dare you, to the indefinite pronoun someone. The generational antagonism shown here is bound up in the I and the you. In both of these instances, I hear a call to action, to use creatively with one's environment, and to collaborate. Toni Morrison later in this account gives us a synthesis after the thesis and antithesis of this generational battle. And the tale ends like this, with the old woman saying to the youth, I trust you now. I trust you with a bird that is not in your hands because you have truly caught it. Look how lovely it is, this thing we have done together. Let's read together. The quotation in the title of my talk comes from Audre Lorde's essay, Poetry is Not a Luxury. In this essay, Lorde teaches us that poetry has a quality of illumination that allows us to form and articulate thought. In our capacity to translate deeply felt feelings to articulable idea, it is our capacity to translate deeply felt feelings to articulable idea. This is an intimacy with our own interiority that we must learn to first bear and then learn to use, that verb again. As we learn to bear the intimacy of scrutiny and to flourish within it, as we learn to use the products of that scrutiny for power within our lives, those fears which rule our lives and form our silences begin to lose their control over us. Fear makes meaning-making difficult. Being unable to move from feeling to language makes us vulnerable. To be able to contemplate and render into language experience is a source of freedom. Because of this, poetry is therefore not a passive indulgence, not a luxury, but rather, especially for Lorde, for women, it is a vital necessity of our existence. It forms the quality of the light within which we predicate our hopes and dreams towards survival and change, first made into language, then into idea, then into more tangible action. Poetry is the way we help give name to the nameless so it can be thought. The farthest horizons of our hopes and fears are cobbled by our poems, carved from the rock experiences of our daily lives, end quote. The relay between personal experience, feeling, and idea is of utmost importance here. It is the first step towards building a collective understanding. Willingness to spend time with the discomfort of the murk before language is, for Lorde, everything. Giving up or giving over power of that stage of thought, that stage when we move from feeling, intuition, into words and language, the sprouts of ideas, is therefore profoundly limiting. Because it is difficult to speak about what we cannot name, a practice of rendering into language is necessary before we can take action or communicate with others about collective action. Because the words we use give shape to the ideas they describe, the misapplication of language has profound dangers too. Lorde writes, as they become known and accepted to ourselves, our feelings and the honest exploration of them become sanctuaries and fortresses and spawning grounds for the most radical and daring of ideas, the house of difference so necessary to change and the conceptualization of any meaningful action. Right now, I could name at least 10 ideas I would have once found intolerable or incomprehensible and frightening, except as they came after dreams and poems. This is not idle fantasy, but the true meaning of "it feels right to me." We can train ourselves to respect our feelings and to discipline, transpose them into a language that matches those feelings so they can be shared. And where that language does not yet exist, it is our poetry which helps us to fashion it. Poetry is not only dream or vision, it is the skeleton architecture of our lives, end quote. So far, I've been contextualizing Lorde's words through the writing of poetry, but as readers of poems too, we can encounter resources for survival in the language of poets. Importantly, we do not have to have had the same feeling or the same feeling made into words to encounter the meaning made from another's work, and we do not have to get things right away. Poetry, though often short, has long durations. Let's read together. Won't you celebrate with me what I have shaped into a kind of life? I had no model, born in Babylon, both non-white and woman. What did I see to be except myself? I made it up, here on this bridge between starshine and clay, my one hand holding tight my other hand. Come celebrate with me that every day something has tried to kill me and has failed. And that poem is by Lucille Clifton. To read this poem for me is in part to recognize myself in the lament and declaration of the speaker. I had no model. I made it up. This poem hangs in my office, and sometimes it seems to describe the university as a space, here on this bridge between starshine and clay. Though I identify with I had no model, I made it up, to read this poem is also to encounter a model, to see in Clifton's infinite wisdom an example of someone being themselves in the face of scarcity or violence, oppression, or silence. To read this poem is then to celebrate, as the speaker suggests, the survival of an other. The I of the poem, its speaker, is not the I of me, the reader, and therefore it cannot be that I am as alone as my recognition of myself in I had no model makes me feel. So what is this moment of reception, this gathering of identification around I had no model? In moments I cognize as crisis, I read every day, yes, this day, something, yes, this thing, has tried to kill me, same, and has failed. As I have moved through reading poetry, I've experienced the sweet and radical humility, which is to know that others have asked these difficult questions. What can I shape into a kind of life? This question takes on urgency when we feel or are in crisis, because words do so much to give shape to our thinking. So a few thoughts on crisis. When I look it up in the dictionary, the OED, the Oxford English Dictionary, says the definition of crisis emphasizes a turning point. A decisive change for better or worse is imminent. Or, this gets me, decisive of recovery or death. It is this pathological meaning that makes clear something that crisis seems to promise, that one way or another it will end. But how do I think about crises that seem unending, or that do not turn at their apparent turning point? If not a form of total closure, the pathological crisis promises amelioration or death. Yet if the urgency of this time is to be cognized, we must have categorical forms suited to the ongoing. So to locate urgencies, both personal and societal, perhaps I need to extend my vocabulary beyond crisis. To think about the chronic is to reorient both towards time and suffering. The misidentification of words, categories of form, is a problem of knowledge, how we know what we know. And I can think about this, I can access this problem through Sylvia Wynter, who cautions me, all of us, to be suspicious of categories. As I read her, Wynter articulates as urgent the knowledge task of examining the categories of knowledge produced, enshrined, and perpetuated by the Academy in order to understand how violences are committed, as she reminds us, by those whom we ourselves have educated. There is an urgency in learning to read and think with care beyond the categories that reproduce violence. I find there are two choices in the face of such repetitions, the repetitions of crisis. Exhausted despair, or accessing the resources, wisdom, and humility to know that others have faced and thought through these questions before me. These questions are not new. They are here in this poem. Let us return to the I. To read this poem is then to celebrate, as the speaker suggests, the survival of an other. This survival is predicated on the crucial distinction between the I of the poem speaker and I, the reader. The work of a single poem's use of I produces genealogies, tightly wound springs of similarity and difference, and not a historical accounting of the shifting uses of I over time, but thinking about how the relays of I, the me of the reader, the I, the speaker of the poem, the I who's the poet, who's not necessarily the same, ought not be thought of as the same as the speaker of the poem, helps me ground the best impulses of my desire to read better, closer, and more care. The closer I look, the more eyes I see. Let's read together. This is from Audre Lorde's A Litany for Survival. And when we speak, we are afraid our words will not be heard nor welcomed, but when we are silent, we are still afraid. So it is better to speak, remembering we were never meant to survive. I find myself drawn to the poetic exploration of what it means to survive the inhospitable and to understand how Black feminist poetics describe the space of foreclosure and possibility that is the subject position of those who were never meant to survive. I haven't read the poem as a whole, and many of you may know it because it's Audre Lorde's most famous work, and if you don't know it, I encourage you to read it after tonight. But there is a insistence on those of us, those of us, those of us, those of us, those of us who, those of us who, those of us who. And what's really interesting to me about that is that the grouping of us and we is provisional. From line to line, those gathered in that word us are different. So Finding similarity and solidarity at the site of difference is some of the important work that that poem does. Audre Lorde will say about difference elsewhere this: difference must not merely be tolerated, but seen as a fund of necessary polarities between which our creativity can spark like a dialectic. Only then does the necessity for interdependency become unthreatening. Only within that interdependency of different strengths, acknowledged and equal, can the power to seek new ways of being in the world generate, as well as the courage and sustenance to act where there are no charters, or indeed, how to act in places where there are charters and are treaties, here on this bridge between starshine and clay. Because to cognize difficulty in ways that have the authenticity and rigor of it feels right to me, not that it feels right to me that is reflexive and reactive, but a deep and rigorous it feels right to me that Lorde is talking about, this means finding language that emerges from experience to connect with others. And in order to do that, we must understand difference through encountering the real, but also, as Clifton does, to imagine. What did I see to be except myself? I made it up. This is a project of the imagination as much as it is a project of being. That literary studies study the made-up worlds of possibility and potentiality means our study need not turn away from the figurative, the metaphoric, or the poetic in order to dismantle and think through structures of power that harm us. We need not, for moments or lines or paragraphs or pages, accept that those structures of power delimit our horizon. We can think and analyze in poetry and fiction and imagine from the vantage point of anything a human mind can conjure. I think of Samuel R. Delaney's science fiction that is narrated by a sentient gemstone, or Alexis Poing-Gums, whose recent biography of Audre Lorde I strongly recommend reading. She has a short story, Evidence, that tells about our present day from a future vantage point beyond sexual violence. We can encounter revolution through the future's archival detritus. We can spend time in a moment free from violence. Alongside encounters with the real, this work is also crucial. Literature affords us access to creation and potential, to the not yet and the could have been. We have resources in time and space. We do not have to accept the metaphysics of now and then. We can reorder and reimagine first principles in order to reach down within ourselves and far across each other. Literature affords us access to analyzing structures. By close reading, a small action, we can get at global scales. We're going to read some more together, and I just wanted to flag that the next poem is about sexual violence. June Jordan's speaker demonstrates this breathtaking devastation, the scaling between the individual and the global in her poem about my rights. I am very familiar with the problems because the problems turn out to be me. I am the history of rape. Here, the speaker challenges our expectation by agreeing with society that has denigrated her and by claiming to be the problem. The familiarity of the problem, however, becomes an important site of insight and a place from which to theorize with a reclaimed lexicon. The next lines I'm going to read might seem at first to self-victim blame. But the thing about the speaker's use of wrong is that she has claimed it as a term that she can theorize anew. I have been raped because I have been wrong. Because I have been the wrong sex, the wrong age, the wrong skin, the wrong nose, the wrong hair, the wrong need, the wrong dream, the wrong geographic, the wrong sartorial I. Instead of an agreement with herself being the problem for being the cause and the reason, the repetition of wrong with each aspect of her identity and presentation builds a crescendo that turns back to criticize a normative society that enables violence against the marginalized by setting them outside of rightness. Here we get the triumphant rejection of the worldview of the wrong. I am not wrong. Wrong is not my name. My name is my own, my own, my own. refusing to claim the name wrong, Jordan returns us via consent to the self, back to an I that is bounded by the specificity of the lyric, by the claiming of I's own name. In this poem, we are thus insistently at the intersection of I and broader structures, scaling between person and abstraction. The question of how to be in the world, to survive and thrive in the face of world-annihilating violence, and to recognize and celebrate that thrivance is key to Black feminist literature. We were never meant to survive, says Lorde, and yet we did. I want to share one more poem with you. This is from a piece by June Jordan called The Difficult Miracle of Black Poetry in America, something like a sonnet for Phyllis Wheatley. For those of you who aren't familiar, Phyllis Wheatley was the first Black poet, woman poet to be published in the U.S. She was born in 1753 in what is now Gambia. She was named Phyllis for the slave ship that brought her across the Atlantic Ocean, and she published poems on various subjects, religious and moral, in 1773. June Jordan's piece is an essay with 2 poems, none of which are quite a sonnet, but I wanted to share this one with you. Like the trees of winter, and like the snow which has no power, makes very little sound, but comes and collects itself, edible light on the black trees, the tall black trees of winter, lifting up a poetry of snow, so that we may be astounded by the poems of black trees inside a cold environment. I'm still getting to know this poem. Every time I read it, I get chills, and not just because I tend to be cold in cold environments. Here, in the broader piece, June Jordan is repeating, it was not natural, it was not natural, it was not natural, it was not natural. And here in this poem, she is rendering Black poetry not only as territorially consistent with the United States. One of the questions she has is, how can you be a national poet when you are so denigrated within the society in which you have been raised? So she's not saying, here is this Black poetry that can sing the nation. She's saying, here is a Black poetry that is nature, that is a Black tree. And I love this line, the edible light on the Black trees. I think so much of what Lorde has told us and taught us about light, the light of poetry that is about encountering those depths of feeling and murk that are pre-linguistic within ourselves to emerge into representation. And so I love that the edible light of the snow on the Black trees here is rendering Black poetry as not only to do with land, but actually emerging and consistent with it. June Jordan says, a poet is somebody free, a poet is someone at home. And so she's asking questions about how can Phyllis Wheatley be a poet if a poet is somebody free? So in rendering into nature the unnatural, she's rendering Black poetry natural via trees. And throughout the poems that I've gathered today, this insistence on growth, on green, on trees, has really struck me as a site for thinking about survival. So look at that early spring green. We're weeks away, but it's going to come, that spring green mist of trees. So to conclude, we've been thinking about I, we've been thinking about we, we've been thinking about you, always. And again, from a poem addressed to the young, remember, green's your color. You are spring. Thank you.
Do you also write poetry of your own?
No, I used to, and it's one of those things that when I haven't done something for a long time, it can feel hard to say yes to that question, but, the more I've read, the more I've thought, it doesn't matter, you know, sometimes it feels like, oh, if I'm not going to be a poet, then why would I do that? But Audre Lorde tells me, because you need to, like, look at yourself and your feelings. So, provisional yes, I'll say provisional yes, but rusty. Thanks for the question.
Have you published them?
Very long time ago. It would take a Google sleuth to find.
I'm just going to repeat the question for our online
sorry,
audience.
yes,
No worries.
I did know that.
So the question was, how long have you been teaching in the university?
Yes. Since July 2019. So both kind of a long time and also a weird time. I got to think about crisis a lot. And this really came, the ideas that I've shared sort of come about, you know, being a person, but also teaching and also living a life in a time of continual crisis. Yes.
So do you have any, like, advice for a young poet? What would be the best thing to do about it, and how do I go about, like, publishing? Trying to do that?
You know, I wish I had better advice for you. I should maybe ask you for advice, but I'd say, the advice that I read from the poets that I admire is to read as much as you can, to reread as much as you can, and to record, you know, put down, externalize the thing that you think, oh, you know, maybe that's the idea, but I should wait until it gets better. Like, you'll write it down and then come back the next day and think, hey, that's pretty good. Yeah. So, and then in terms of publishing, I think there are, you know, I don't have a good answer to that. But if you are affiliated with an institution, for example, there might be some publishing opportunities there. I know that the kind of online poetry scene has been shifting recently, so I'm not sure how online submissions work. But the other thing that I know from people who are much more actively writing is that you do need to exercise the muscle of rejection, and to send things out and to be resilient to the no that you're going to get. I have a good friend who compiled a negative CV to say, here are all the things because everyone's like, oh my gosh, you get everything that you apply for. She's like, I get a fraction of the things that I applied for. Here are all the things that I applied for, and here are the gems that look like I'm going from win to win. So I think, fostering the resilience of rejection, which in academia too, that's a big one. Sending things out. Yes.
You connected the dots between the different pieces and how the writers have found, have like sort of situated resilience in the theme of, let's say, like nature or something that is of the natural world. I was curious if there are other themes that sort of emerge within these writers' work that are also speaking to that sort of that sense of resilience and survival.
Yeah.
I'm just going to, repeat the question. So the question was about the themes in the writer's works in relation to nature?
Other than nature.
Other than nature.
Other themes emerge. I think a lot about community and a lot about friendship, and especially for Audre Lorde and June Jordan, often that friendship is also erotic relation that has a sort of spectrum of identification. And so really, like, being with people, when Audre Lorde talking about different sparks between us, like a dialectic, she's thinking about intimate relations as well as broader systemic relations of difference. So I do think that question of how to be with each other is happening at each scale and begins very much within the sort of intimacy of friendship and partnership.
I do have a couple online questions. The first one is, what do you think Audre Lorde would think of the access to writing through social media for Black women now?
That's a good question. I mean, I think that she would be excited by it. I can't voice for her, but I think that when Audre Lorde was writing and publishing, although she experienced an enormous amount of success, she also experienced a lot of rejection that was inflected by racism, that was inflected by homophobia, that was inflected by her not writing the type of thing that people thought other people wanted to read. And usually when people make those sorts of assumptions, they might also be wrong. And so I think that from that perspective, she also, made opportunities for herself and others to publish. So I think that she would be excited by the proliferation of writing. Yeah.
I just wanted to say I really appreciate the breakdown that you did with the thematic structure of the noun and the interrogation of those. I come from a social work background, but I find frequently in my writing now where I've gotten to a point where I am using very particular statements that are structured with particular nouns, and I repeat those in moments of urgency where I'm trying to stress some type of transition or I'm trying to provide some urgent analysis. And so I question often, are these repeated statements worth interrogating further to understand my own subjectivity, but also understand the political context?
Yeah.
And you really just gave me some really good insight into the importance of that. So even when I've given my writing to other people and I've gotten feedback from whether it's my friends or whatnot, they would question very innocently, who is we and who is I?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, the comment was about interrogate. Like I really love what you said about you need to constantly interrogate the language that maybe becomes very naturalized to us. I remember long ago learning, does this need to be said by me? Does this need to be said? Does this need to be said by me? Does this need to be said by me now? And I think there's a version that's like, is this still true? Like something can have been true and can have been useful, can have been the most useful thing. And sometimes we can get attached to the particular formulation of something that's been of use in a way that might no longer, serve us. So thanks for that comment.
I have another question from online. This one's from Montreal. I, too, don't say that I am a poet. However, that seems to be the only and most effective way for me to process my emotions. And I didn't quite understand why, but your talk has offered clarity and inspiration for me to look into the poets you shared tonight and pursue my project of writing. Not a question, a comment, apologies. I do have a question underneath that one, though.
I love that comment, though. Thank you so much. I think that anyone wanting to read more is wonderful. And likely you are a poet.
We can go to another in-person one and then.
I was just going to ask the author, Audre Lorde, is there any book or anything you can recommend that you read? And I've never read any book from this author, but now I'm very interested.
So she has a collection of essays called Sister Outsider, and Poetry is Not a Luxury is one of the essays in that collection. I would strongly recommend that.
Sorry,
Sister Outsider.
Okay.
She also, so Lorde died of breast cancer at 58, and she wrote and published a book called Cancer Journals, where she is thinking about the embodied experience of having undergone treatment and facing mortality, and that's another really astonishing book. And so I begin with either of those or her collected works of poetry. You can get a sort of massive one that's nearly everything, or an individual collection might be Black Unicorn.
Okay, thank you very much.
So another online question, also from Montreal. Do you see survival instincts in the poetry of American poets and poets from the rest of the diaspora manifesting differently? Are we concerned about the same things in the same ways?
That's a really good question. I'm silent because I'm thinking.
Do you see survival instincts in the poetry of American poets and poets from the rest of the diaspora manifesting differently? Are we concerned about the same things in the same ways?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, for example, Audre Lorde is the child of immigrants from the Caribbean, and so there is a way that when you begin thinking about a category that might seem self-evident, like African American, for example, that can very quickly get into questions of diaspora within a sort of generation, rather than thinking about a singular diaspora story. So I do think that I see a lot of continuities across the diaspora, in part because many of the influences are very similar, certainly in the 20th century. I do think that the specificity of state violence is going to be really different within, for example, a settler colonial nation state versus a post-colonial nation state that is sort of struggling with, for example, neocolonialism and the ways that imperialism keeps pace with political independence. So that there's a political structure that could be a very different site of response, but also because of American hegemony, often it's very relevant to continue criticizing the U.S. state, even from a vantage point of, like, Grenada, for example. I don't know if that answers.
Would you say that there's anything today that is equivalent to these labels?
So the question was, do you think there is anything today that is equivalent to the authors and poets that you had mentioned?
John Brand, Emma Grizzly Phillip, both who live in Toronto. Desiree Bailey is sort of my generation. She was in Massachusetts, and she has a beautiful collection called What Noise Against the Cane, I believe. It's in my bag back there, but I don't have it ahead of me. Yeah, those are the three people that come to mind. And I think that the more I read, the more I find. So I would say, yeah, maybe beginning John Brand, Emma Grizzly Phillip, and Desiree Bailey. John Brand and Emma Grizzly Phillip are more similar generation, and Desiree Bailey is just published her first collection. Kenisia Lubrin, yeah, amazing poets working now.
Another online question. There's a history of lament through religion. Do you find there is a different type of hope in crisis for Black female poets who are of a religious background?
That's a good question. I think that the lexicon of religion comes up a lot, and whether or not people are continuing to practice within, for example, a Christian denomination, a lot of imagery of Christianity becomes a resource for expressing lament, as you mentioned, suffering, transfiguration. I mean, it is a sort of cultural touchstone. Someone like Sonia Sanchez, who was a member of the Nation of Islam, has a really deep connection to Islam, and I believe that has influenced her poetic expression. I think that a lot of the poets that I'm reading might struggle to have that as the only cultural touch point. And so you see, for example, in Audre Lorde, thinking about syncretic practices, thinking about West African religious practices, and that being so syncretic means that it's kind of compatible with other religious forms. So you see a lot of mixing of ritual, but a lot of seeking after ritual, I will say. That there's a desire for ritual, and an openness to combining ritual practices.
I really like the idea of close reading and how you walked through looking at poems with pronouns and verbs and everything else. I'm curious, what other strategies or ways would you attempt close reading? What else could we say with this experience?
How much more time do we have? Enough time? Hour 2.
So the question was about different strategies that can be used when doing a close reading.
Let me just go back to, yes, you can go back to this one. I mean, things like looking at illusions, a question about religious illusions, born in Babylon, that's both a Christian illusion and also references Rastafari, references to the Western world as Babylon, so it's doing dual work within a sort of Western framework and a critique of the West from within the West framework. So I might go through and think about all the illusions. I do a lot of things like looking up words to make sure that I know what they mean. Thinking about figurative language, so metaphor and simile. This bridge between starshine and clay as a really beautiful example of a metaphor. Even the idea of every day something has tried to kill me and has failed as an invitation to celebrate. I would think about how is the reader of the poem being invited into it, how is the reader being addressed. So they're being addressed by come celebrate with me. I would think about whether or not all the examples of poems had an I, so they were all sort of in a lyric tradition. So I would think about the speaker, but there are lots of poems that don't have an I, and that might have a different, actually the last poem doesn't have an I, does it? Exactly. There's no I. There's no lyric I in this poem. So those are some of the ways that I would start. But you get really, and maybe 13 of the things that you notice, you're like, okay, that's the case. But sometimes the 14th, you're like, oh, I see. I mean, even thinking about line breaks, going back to Come Celebrate With Me. I know this poem very well, and very recently I sort of fell in love with this line, my other hand with a semicolon, Come Celebrate, and thinking about the line break. I had always read it, my one hand holding tight my other hand, and then thinking, actually, if it's just this line in isolation, my other hand becomes this invocation in a new way. So, yes, those are some places I start. Thank you.
So this is from a different person who is responding to your response with a question about religion. Okay. I think in response to the last question from Montreal regarding the religion, when I think about writings from the Black diaspora question, we are writing the same story in different ways, the stories of resistance. And then, sorry, I think I lost the question, but that was just a response. And then I think they go on to say, what advice or tips would you offer poets and those of us who love and think poetically when resisting as a Black woman?
Yeah. Just to the first point, Edward Glissant talks about the cry of this plantation being translated into the speech of the world. I'm paraphrasing, so I might be wrong, but there's also something about similar structures. I mean, thinking about the fact of enslavement in Canada, in the U.S., in the Caribbean, there are conditions of life that are differently oriented because of those geographies, but also produce a common structure for response. The question was, advice for, poets and survival? Sorry, I had it in my mind and then I spoke.
What advice or tips would you offer for beginner poets, for those of us who love and think poetically when resisting as Black women?
I mean, again, I'm coming from a very specific position, which is that I get to teach literature in the context of the university. And so that's both and this amazing context in which to think and do this work, and also can sometimes mean that that's the context that I think of first when I'm being asked something like that, which is a really valuable question. I think that every movement needs people who are doing the work of singing about it or writing about it. The Black Arts Movement, for example, came up alongside the Black Power movement in order to say, this isn't just about politics without culture. Like, this is also to say, we need to rethink, if we're rethinking how we orient ourselves towards things like empire, and if we're thinking about what it would mean to experience sovereignty, we also need to have an imaginative and creative arm of that movement. And for many people, the Black Arts Movement has never ended because that has never, has not yet been achieved. But the work is ongoing, not that people working in that movement, they have done fantastic work, but that work is not done. So, yeah, I think understanding that the creative and cultural work that goes alongside other forms of perhaps more immediately material activism has a long tradition of being profoundly valuable. Mm-hmm. Okay.
If all these authors were here now, which one do you think would be friends?
The question was, if all of these authors were here now, which ones would be friends?
So, I mean, folks knew each other, and folks were in relation to each other. Audre Lorde and June Jordan were dear friends until they fell out, and then it's not known whether they spoke again after falling out. They had I mean, it's topical. They fell out over Palestine, yeah. Sorry, I'm stumbling over words because I want to be careful and honor the context of their friendship and their relation, because they continued to sort of speak of each other with great warmth, but at a time when there needed to be some calling into a conversation, feelings were hurt and stayed hurt for a long time. I'd say that would be a way to paraphrase it. June Jordan particularly was a very strident activist for this Palestinian cause, and felt that Audre Lorde had betrayed her by signing an open letter that was, yeah, anyway, sorry, getting into more detail, but yeah, so maybe a less fun answer to the question, but folks knew each other, and sometimes different sparks like a dialectic. Yeah.
Yeah, one more question for you. Who's your favorite author?
So the question was, who is her favorite author?
How dare you? Oh, that's so mean. Oh, that's so hard. Well, there are libraries, you know. People borrow books from a library. That's hard.
Okay, who's your first author then? That you ever read that you like?
I'm gonna answer your question. So I think the poem that has given me most is the Lucille question poem. I think that I think if there was a situation in which I could memorize one poem and only have it in my brain, I think that would be the one that I choose. The one that I feel like, I'd like all my students to have encountered is the Gwendolyn Brooks poem. And my favorite author to teach is Toni Morrison. So, there I answered. But then Audre Lorde helps me, like, think and live. So, all of the people that I mentioned.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So we have 2 more online questions, and I think we'll have
And then one in the room? Okay.
So for the 2 online ones, so the first is, do you think these poets you've cited tonight would believe that poetry is something that is not confined to the written word? And the second is, how do you see poetry of Black women evolving as feminism evolves through successive waves?
Absolutely. I mean, the oral tradition of poetry is extremely long. I already mentioned Sonia Sanchez, and if you have a chance to watch recordings of her performing poetry, sometimes she's has like an music words that I can't recall to my mind. Improvisation, an improvised band, like with her making sort of really Amiri Baraka, well, less a feminist poet, but yeah, there's a whole real mixture of aesthetic forms happening within oral poetry traditions that are, I mean, ancient, but also 20th century. Yeah, I think that so many of the questions that animate this generation of poets continue to speak to new demographics of people, even if Audre Lorde's work on sexuality and gender, for example, might not have been framed in the terms that we might use now. A lot of folks can read her and say, aha, like here's my ancestors too. Here is a model that I have. So I do think that there's a sort of a springing eternal happening. Can you answer that?
So I don't really have a question. I just want to thank you for sharing this piece piece because I'm trying to write more in my language. I don't really have words for this. I don't have a lot of like some of my people don't really write poetry in our language. This shows that language.
You're very welcome. I'm glad that it resonated with you. Yeah.